Stan Taylor received his PhD at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, a school administered jointly by Tufts University, MIT, and Harvard. He joined the Department of Political Science at Brigham Young University in 1968 after teaching at both Tufts University and Bentley College in Boston for 5 years. He has been the chair of the political science departments at both Bentley College and at Brigham Young University. Professor Taylor was one of the founders of the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies at BYU. He was appointed by the former Utah Senator Jake Garn as a senior staff member of the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and his most recent book is America, the Vincible, U.S. Foreign Policy for the 21st Century. In recognition of his superior scholarship and substantial academic contribution to BYU, he was named a University Alcuin Fellow in 2002. His wife, who is here with him today, and we recognize her, is Victoria Richards Taylor, and they are the parents of 5 children. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Taylor.
Thanks very much, Brian, and I'm honored to be here. It's a great privilege to be asked to give the House of Learning lecture, and I only hope that I can do so in the manner that my predecessors have established. I will try to rise to the occasion. My voice is not quite rising with me, and so you might forgive me once in a while as I sip on some water and try to soothe out the vocal cords. I've been asked to talk to you today about terrorism and intelligence, particularly focusing on intelligence reform since the terrorist attacks in the United States in 2000. Let me try to set the lights here and get the screen ready. Throughout this lecture, there's a few things I'm going to try to accomplish, but I wanted to start with a story that was told to me by Joseph Nye. Joe Nye was Assistant Secretary of Defense for years and is the director of the Kennedy Center at Harvard. He said that his wife once sent him an anniversary card on their wedding anniversary. On the front of it, it read, "Happy anniversary. You were an answer to my prayers." When he opened it, it read, "But you were not what I prayed for." We in the United States and many around the world find ourselves in a similar situation. For many years, we prayed to be free of the threat of international communism, and we wanted the Cold War to go away, and all of a sudden it did. But the world which we received at that time is not quite what we'd hoped for either. We have now smaller states, rogue states, and non-state entities that pose serious threats to our national security. So today I'm going to try to address 5 questions, answer them if I can. Do we still need intelligence agencies? Would some reorganization help? Do they need more money? Do they need more personnel? And finally, what kinds of internal changes might help? There used to be a lot of people, particularly at the end of the Cold War, saying that we ought to get rid of the CIA and other intelligence agencies. Some of them knew better, and some of them didn't know better. But it seems that no one is talking about that anymore after September 11. I've always thought of the famous axiom of the British Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Lord Palmerston. He said, "We have no permanent friends and no permanent allies or enemies, only permanent interests." It's a realist axiom, but it does suggest that we always need to be alert to developments in the world. More recently, the famous Cold War scholar John Lewis Gaddis had this to say on virtually the same subject. He said, "The absence of imminent threat is no guarantee that threats do not exist." So let me start with my first question. That is, would some sort of reorganization of the intelligence community help? And to answer that, I hope, let me show you what the intelligence community looks like now. This is the official organizational chart of the U.S. intelligence community. At the center is the Director of Central Intelligence. we'll refer to him several times through this lecture today, and I'll usually use the acronym DCI. He has a management staff and an analytical staff called the National Intelligence Council. And then he is also director of the CIA. He wears two hats, in other words. So there's the Central Intelligence Agency. And the other 12 are also agencies within the intelligence community. The Defense Intelligence, National Security, Army, Navy, and so on. Notice that there are 8 entities that are all part of the Department of Defense. There are 4 entities that are separate departments, each of which has an intelligence focus within it. So you might ask yourself, what does the DCI direct? The National Security Act of 1947 says he directs, coordinates all intelligence. And theoretically he does and should, but keep in mind he only has control over one agency. That, I think, is also one of the problems. But nevertheless, this chart, as you can see, is solid looking. Looks like it's going to keep enemies out and give us all the information we need. It's not bad in theory. This is what the intelligence community looks like in practice. I must apologize to Mr. Bennett for doctoring up his Pulitzer Prize winning cartoon. But this is what it looks like in practice, with each stave in the fence being a separate intelligence agency, and with many kinds of enemies being able to sneak in between. So we have a problem. We have agencies with similar responsibilities, overlapping jurisdictions, who fail to communicate and correlate with one another. Just as for one example, you might be interested to know that there are approximately 45 separate entities within the intelligence community which have jurisdiction over terrorism. 45. They fail to communicate, they fail to correlate, and we have intelligence problems. So what can we do about such a problem? Well, let me show you what we've done in the past about it, and then we'll see if it works. Let me first focus on what is called the National Counterintelligence Center, created in 1994, reorganized in 2001. I don't know if any of you remember what happened in 1994 that might have occasioned the creation of this. It was a very significant event in the intelligence field. CIA officer who had been with the agency for many, many years was revealed to be a Soviet and Russian spy. And as a result of that, they decided that these agencies are not communicating and not correlating, so they created a new one. They called it the CIC. It's its acronym now, it's NCIX. And it's supposed to solve the problem. Well, what happened in 2001? Some of you might remember that Robert Hansen, who had worked for the FBI for many, many years, was revealed as a Soviet/Russian spy. The very organization we created to prevent that didn't do anything. Why? Because even in this organization, and here's a quotation right from their official press release, even in this organization, you'll notice that this CTC, CIC, Counterintelligence Center, draws its personnel from FBI, CIA, DIA, NSA, and other agencies. Now, these agencies loan personnel to that counterintelligence center, and they're supposed to sit and correlate with one another. But what happens is that they're all more loyal to the people back home who give them their raises and their advancements. So we don't get the kind of correlation that we need. Second example, in 1986, after a series of significant terrorist events in the early 80s, we created a counter-terrorist center, again, to do the same thing, to solve the same problem. Here's a quotation right from its webpage. It draws its personnel from, and there's the list again. Each one of those is a stave in the cartoon that I showed you. These personnel all spend their day at the counterterrorist center, but they get their pay and their rank advancement, and they're loyal to the organizations from which they've been loaned. Now, when a problem is created by too many organizations with overlapping jurisdictions and responsibilities, what do you think the chances are that creating a new organization will solve the problem? Well, I think they're slim. As we all know, two of the 9/11 terrorists were already on a government watch list, a list created to prevent people on the list from getting into the United States. Why did they get in? Because the agencies represented in the CTC weren't correlating with one another. In other words, what we have tried to do in the past has not worked terribly well. And I get concerned, Washington Post journalist Ronald Kessler reported recently that the White House is considering creating a new domestic intelligence agency modeled after MI5 in England. That would just add another layer. I submit that creating new organizations to solve a problem brought on by the existence of too many organizations just does not make a lot of sense. In fact, I think it's a problem that even movie stars could figure out. What we have here is a failure to communicate. Those famous lines were uttered, as you remember, by Paul Newman in Cool Hand Luke. And that's what we do have. We have a failure to communicate. So let's ask some questions. Would reorganization help? Well, it might. One of the things we've done is created a new Department of Homeland Security. A lot of people want to know if that will help. And we hope that it will. My judgment, probably not. And I think I can explain to you why. I know you can't read that. I meant it to be so you couldn't read it. But the Department of Homeland Security was drawn from sub-agencies of all of these other departments, all centered into a new Department of Homeland Security. Now, if you could read the fine print there, then you should ask yourself a question. There's something missing. There's something seriously missing. There's no CIA in that organization. There's no DIA, Defense, there's no National Security, there's no Army, none of the intelligence community agencies are members of the Department of Homeland Security. So what we have is instead another picket that we're going to add to our fence, this time labeled Homeland Security. In fact, when Governor Tom Ridge was sustained to that, was officially put in as Director of Homeland Security just last week, the press report said that he was supposed to, quote, correlate all intelligence functions. Well, he doesn't even have the major intelligence agencies in his Homeland Security Department. So reorganization would help if it would reduce the number of agencies and if it would give the DCI the authority to control the wages and the advancement of those people who work in the intelligence community. Now, if they don't do that, then it just adds additional layers of bureaucracy, either alongside or on top of what already exists, and fails to give the DCI the kind of power that I feel he needs. Well, let's turn to another related question, and that is, would more money help? Traditionally, in America, we have two ways to fix problems. We reorganize, and oftentimes reorganization is merely because we don't know what else to do. Public is demanding that we do something, so in the absence of knowing what to do, we reorganize. It's rarely a quick fix. Often it does more harm than good. Sometimes it does help. And the second thing we've learned to do in America when we have a problem is we throw money at it. So let's look at that second question a moment and ask if more money might help. And the answer to that is, who knows? The intelligence budget is officially classified top secret. So we don't know how much money they get. A lot of people guess, but there are only a few people who know officially how much money the CIA and other agencies in the intelligence community are given. I can give you some substantiated facts. I don't think we'll dwell on them. I'll run through them quickly, but These are facts that I can verify are true. It started out 1947 when it was created with $3 million. 1968, its budget was up to $5 billion. 1990, it was getting about $30 billion a year. 1997, a remarkable event occurred. The DCI, Director of Central Intelligence, held a press conference and officially announced how much money they had. First time in 200 years plus of American history that had been done. He said we have $26.6 billion. Next year, he did the same thing, only it had gone up slightly. We were all waiting in 1999 for the similar announcement, and it didn't come. Press reports continue to say that it gets about $30 billion, but I can tell you that within a week after 9/11, Congress and the President gave it $1.8 billion additional money solely for intelligence. I can tell you that in 2002, President Bush requested an additional $1.4 billion for intelligence and communication. So I can give you my personal guess. If you include all of the people, sometimes the budget doesn't, if you include all of the people who work in the intelligence community one way or another, I think its budget is between $40 and $50 billion. I'm not convinced that more money would help. I think it depends not on the amount of money, but rather on how that money is spent. I talked to an employee at the Counterterrorist Center last year. He said the only way we can spend the hundreds of millions of dollars we now have after 9/11 is to upgrade on trips from business class to first class. He didn't think it was a matter of money at all in the Counterterrorist Center. Well, let's turn to the question then of personnel. Would more people help? And here again, it's difficult to know because that number is also classified. My best guess is that the total intelligence community is somewhere between 90,000 and 110,000. And if you count military people seconded to the intelligence agencies, it probably goes up to about 120 or 30,000. Like money, I just don't think more people would help. In fact, a strange climate is developed in Washington. When budget time comes, the traditional way to get budget was to go to Congress and tell them how much you need. Nowadays they go to Congress and Congress says, how much do you need? We'll give you anything you want. In fact, competitive giving has started to occur. The House wants to show it's more vigilant than the Senate, so they take the Senate bill and add more money to it and vice versa. A senior FBI official told me, this is an official that works in the Counterterrorism Center, said that since 9/11, the number of FBI special agents working on counterterrorism had quadrupled. The number of analysts doubled, and the number of JTTFs, that's a Joint Terrorist Task Force, used to be 6 before September 11. It's now up to 56. As with money, in my judgment, more personnel is not the answer. It depends on how those personnel are used and where they're placed. I think we would all agree that 1,000 additional workers in the intelligence community wouldn't necessarily help, but one more intelligence asset who was placed within Al-Qaeda might have helped a great deal. It's not the number of people that count, it's how we use them. Here's a few suggestions that I would make as to things we could do with internal reform within the intelligence community that I think would help. I'll go over each one of these individually. Number one, develop a grand strategy. We don't often have a good, sound national strategy that allows all of our defense, foreign policy, and intelligence entities to work well together. When the Bush administration came into office, they had a very focused grand strategy. Unfortunately, it was focused on anti-missile defense. They had spent all of their time and effort, had all of their ducks in place to get a new anti-missile defense system in place. If you read the first report that the National Intelligence Council, the highest analytical body, issued when the Bush administration came in place, you will find an amazing lack of any mention of the word terrorism. Everything was, we've got to look out for missile attacks from rogue states, Iran, Iraq, North Korea, and so on. And so intelligence agencies followed suit. That's where they were looking. That's the information they were trying to collect. It's not an accident that prior to 9/11, there was not a lot of attention being paid to Al-Qaeda. Not a lot at all. Second, we have to avoid unnecessary duplication. I mentioned to you earlier that there are 45 separate agencies that deal with terrorism inside the intelligence community. That's way too many. That discourages efficiency. It creates problems that I'll talk about later that are even worse than inefficiency. Now, some duplication in intelligence collection is necessary. That is, we need electronic intelligence, we need human intelligence, and so on, and one feeds the other, and vice versa. But duplication in the analytical side of the intelligence community, I think, is very bad. It does a lot of bad things. It creates, among other things, what we call worst-case scenarios, and you can understand that if you've ever worked in a large bureaucracy. If you've got 45 agencies working on counterterrorism, none of them wants to be made to look bad. They're competing with one another for personnel and for dollars. They don't want to look bad. And of course, the immediate way to look bad is to not predict some bad thing that happens. So they develop worst-case scenarios that they say might happen. If it doesn't happen, then they're able to say, well, at least we were prepared. If it does happen, they're able to say, I told you so, give me some more money and some more personnel. I don't know if any of you remember, but in 1988, in the Vincennes Persian Gulf Battle Group, the battleship USS Sides shot down an Iranian civilian airliner, killed hundreds of people. The commander of that ship later on said that we were put on edge by so many worst-case scenarios coming from so many different elements within the intelligence community that, in all honesty, he said, we were just trigger-happy. That's just one of the bad things that happens, I think, when you have duplication in the analytical process. Number 3, we need to learn to avoid single enemy intelligence approaches. Many of the problems we had during the Cold War came because we were focused on one single enemy and on one aspect of that enemy, military capabilities. Many bad things happened during the Cold War because we weren't focusing on them. A study that I did when I worked for the Senate years ago, I think would still be approximately true. Half of most of the annual crises come from the low priority category of the prioritization list. It needs explaining, doesn't it? The intelligence community puts together what's called an NIT, National Intelligence Topics, and they're ranked in priority. And through the Cold War, all of the Soviet and Warsaw Pact and Chinese military capabilities occupied the top 70 slots. Now, you can well guess what's occupying the top slots. It's all to do with terrorism. And yet, I have found that half of the crises that come up during a year will come from the bottom third of that list. A senior officer, in fact, the director of the House Intelligence Committee, told me that counterterrorism, to use his phrase, is sucking resources from everything else inside the intelligence community. Number 4, we could improve our analysis. I'd like to spend just a minute on that. For one thing, we need to recruit analysts who write better. I talked to the head of the National Intelligence Council in November, and he said, we get a lot of analysts, he said, who come into the government, but he said, I have to spend the first 8 months teaching them what a direct object is. That's a metaphor, but of course he's talking about teaching them how to write. We don't do a terribly good job of that, and we all need to work on that. One thing that would help a great deal, and it's a simple thing, you send analysts out to work with their users of the intelligence, the foreign policymakers. Let them spend 6 months in their office. Then they learn what they need. They learn how to tailor the intelligence to the needs of the office. It's being done to some extent. We need to do it much, much more. We need to cut out the layers of review that exist within the analytical side of the intelligence community. A former student of mine who's an analyst reported that it was impossible now to do analytical work. She said, I do my review, I send it up. The review committee sends it back and says, no, you got to do this, and do that, so I do. I send it back up. They pass it to a committee review above that. They read it, and they say, no, you better say this and this. She said, those are the things I said the first time. And it'll go through 3 or 4 or 5 of those layers before it ever reaches an intelligence user. I think there's a lot of redundancy there that we could cut out. And we've got to improve language skills. We do a good job of that at this university. But we're the only major power in the world where you can be an educated person and only speak one language. You probably have read the newspaper reports, they're true, that communications between al-Qaeda operatives in the week prior to September 11 were recorded by NSA, but not translated until 3 weeks after 9/11. It's just a shortage of personnel and skills. Number 5, we need to solve our collection problems. We have a superb collection system, but it's plagued by 2 things, 2 serious problems. One is leaks, unauthorized releases of information. I could regale you with stories about the damage that leaks have done. Time doesn't permit. I'll just tell you maybe one. The CIA had developed an ingenious method of overhearing, listening in on all Politburo conversations in the 1960s. They had geosynchronous satellite. The Politburo communications were mostly on car telephones, and they were picking up all of that. A columnist in Washington, D.C., Jack Anderson, heard about that, printed it in his newspaper. 2 days later, all conversations ceased. 1998, a senior official in the United States government who knows better stood and said in a public audience that he knew that al-Qaeda was responsible for a lot of evil things. He was talking about the embassy bombings because he said, we're listening into their cell phone calls. 3 days later, all cell phone communication between al-Qaeda personnel stopped. The other problem is stovepiping. It's a technical term in the intelligence field that I can illustrate and tell you about quickly. This is the theory of intelligence. Each one of these is an intelligence discipline. Open source intelligence, human intelligence, and so on. In theory, they all collect information. They send it into the central analytical group where it's analyzed, put in context, made sense of. Then it's given to the users, the foreign policy makers, the people who have to make the decisions. That's the theory. It's a good theory in practice. In practice, this is the way it works. SIGINT, that is National Security Agency, they get something that is really hot. They overhear that al-Qaeda is planning to hijack a plane next month and crash it into the Eiffel Tower. So they want to beef up their opportunities and their recognition. So rather than getting it analyzed, they get in a car, they rush straight to the White House, go right through the analytical agencies, go straight to the White House, pass that information on. Well, maybe these people down here in the human intelligence business, maybe they know that al-Qaeda is also initiating a deception campaign and that this is part of it. See, intelligence means nothing standing alone. In spite of what Thomas Jefferson said, not all things are self-evident, and it takes a lot of analysis to make sense out of it. 6, we need to improve asset recruitment. Unfortunately, an asset, by the way,